Hi, today we're going to talk about the 5th grade Math Plus Yellow Unit 6, which covers decimals and multiplication and division. The first couple of lessons are things that have already been covered in Class Connect sessions. We've already talked about multiplying, dividing by powers of 10, but this is a very tricky standard that many students often have trouble with, determining how a number gets larger and smaller by multiplying by powers of 10, and we also have talked about expanding and comparing decimal numbers. These are both items that are on the current pathway. As we progress, we're going to use skills that we talked about earlier on rounding, but this time we're going to round to estimate when we multiply and divide. And then the rest of the units or lessons in this unit cover multiplying, dividing decimals. But I will say that some of these activities go into numbers that are larger than your child will see on the end of the year assessment, and they go into modeling, or they don't go into modeling, but they do go into the standard algorithm, which follows a very procedural step-by-step approach to decimals, and that is also not something that is talked about in the standards. In fact, let me show you the standard before we get going. This unit focuses on 5 NBT7, or 5th grade numbers in base 10 operations. And so we are in lesson 7 or standard 7, and it says add, subtract, multiply, and divide decimals to hundredths using concrete models or drawings and strategies based on place value, properties of operations, and or the relationship between addition and subtraction, relate the strategy to a written method, and explain the reasoning used. We do not require students to use the standard algorithm when multiplying and dividing larger numbers. In fact, it says this work should focus on concrete models and pictorial representations rather than relying solely on the algorithm. So after this, I go through the OLS, I'm going to show you some ways and strategies so that you can multiply and divide decimals by using concrete models so that we can build that appropriate conceptual understanding. We will use grid models. Right here, they're adding 1 whole and 25 hundredths and 40 hundredths or 4 tenths and 75 hundredths, and then they're adding them all together to see how many they have in all using grid paper. We'll also talk about how to use the area model to multiply and how to use models and groups of tenths to divide. So you can always search for the standards by searching the standard number, which is 5 NBT 7, and to learn a little bit more about this and to find different strategies to implement on your own as a learning coach. So let's head on over to the student activity book. Remember, if you want to go straight to this unit, you can simply go to online book menu on the side and open it up to decimal multiplication, and then when you click that down arrow, the very first lesson, which is on multiply and divide by powers of 10, will pop up. As I mentioned, multiplying and dividing by powers of 10 is a critical component to the standards. We want students to understand what happens when you make a number 10 times bigger, 100 times bigger, or even 1,000 times bigger. When you have 10 to the 0 power, you're basically only multiplying by 1 because we don't have any tens. When you multiply by 10 to the first power, you have one group of 10. When you multiply by 10 to the second power, or 10 squared, we have 10 times 10. That's 100. And then 10 to the third power would be 10 times 10 times 10, which is the same as 1,000. So if we multiply a number times 10 to the third, or 10 cubed, we're making the number 1,000 times bigger. It's important to talk about the value of digits and how the value of a digit changes based on its place within a number. Here we have a 1, 2, and a 4, and a 1, 2, and 4, but the value of these digits is very different. The 1 here is in the tens, the 1 here is in the hundreds. We multiplied this number, 12 and 4 tenths, by 10 and made it 10 times bigger, and you can see that we moved the decimal over and shifted everything. So we shifted everything to the left. When we multiply, we move to the left. And some of you that went to Class Connects remember we did Mr. DL. We multiply, or it's like MR. The decimal moves to the right like this, and that means all these digits though shift to the left. So it's a little confusing. So we have multiply to the right, divide to the left, and so the decimal is going to move. So when we have Mr. DR, we think about the decimal moving, but when we talk about Study Island, they may say the numbers shift to the left, and that's actually what happens. The decimal moves to the right, but the numbers shift to the left. So it's important to really model those. And in fact, there is a game that I'll include the link to, and you can select the button that says question, and it'll say, okay, if we have 4 and 4/10, but we multiply it times 10, okay, when we multiply, we're going to move that decimal to the right, but when that happens, these numbers move this way. It shifts to the left. So the decimal technically moved over, and we have now 44 instead of just 4 and 4/10. Let's try another one. What happens if we make a number 100 times bigger? That means we're going to make this, we're going to move 2 spaces, but I do need to add in an extra 0. I can't just leave it blank. And so I have 7,680. And as you continue to go through, you'll have combinations of multiplication and division. When you divide, a number gets smaller, so we need to go this way, and our 1 whole now becomes a 10th and then a 100th, and we've got to add in a 0. So 1 and 2/10 now became 12 thousandths. So this is a great game to practice in reinforcing what happens when we multiply and what happens when we divide. So let's go back to the OLS. The one thing that's important to think about as you make numbers 10 times bigger, 100 times bigger, and 1,000 times bigger is that this digit or this exponent doesn't just mean add 3 zeros. We're making it 1,000 times bigger. You can see this number was 1,000 times bigger, but we didn't add 3 zeros here. This 0 in the tenths doesn't even change the value. So when we write it out, the answer doesn't even have to have that 0 after the decimal. So it doesn't mean the number of zeros you add. It talks about how many times bigger that number is. When we divide, we move the decimal the opposite way, and the numbers get smaller and smaller. It can become 10 times smaller, 100 times smaller, or even 1,000 times smaller. So pay close attention to the fact that it's not just about a trick. It's not just about adding zeros. It's about making things 10 times bigger, 10 times smaller, and so on. So as we go through, you will again talk about expanding decimals and writing decimals in different ways. Now this activity book doesn't necessarily have an activity on expanding decimals, so I'm going to show you my webcam here. And this is stuff that you will see in the lessons, and you will see it in the OLS, but let's write a decimal. Let's say we have 24 and 71 hundredths. If I were to write that in standard form, I would write 24, and every time I get to a decimal, I put the word and. We always want to put an and when we get to a decimal. And then we have 71, and I always use whatever the digit is in the last spot, I use that word, and we have hundredths. And it's important that we encourage students to write that TH when they're decimals. We have our tenths, hundredths, and then thousandths. And then the tricky part comes to expanded form. So we're going to write 24 and 71 hundredths in expanded form. We're used to writing numbers in expanded form, but we're not always thinking about the value of the digits when we do expanded form. So what I want you to think about is how many times we multiply something by 10 or hundreds. So right here we have a 2 right here, but we're making it 10 times bigger because it's in the tens. And then we're going to add that to the 4. The 4 is in the ones. So we just need to multiply it by 1. Then we're going to add that to the 7, but the 7 is in the tenths spot. So we're going to only need 1/10 or 7/10. And so we're going to multiply 7 times 1/10 because it's not a whole number, it's a part of a whole. And then we're going to continue to add, and we have a 1, but the 1 is in the hundredths. So we're going to multiply the 1 times 1 over 100 to make 1/100ths. So in Study Island and in the OLS, you'll see numbers like this written in expanded form like this. We multiply by the value and then add to the next digit, which is a 4, multiply by the value, it's in the ones, then add to the next digit, which is a 7, multiply by the value, which is in the tenths, add to the next digit, which is a 1, and multiply the value, which is in the hundredths. The lessons that you have in the activity guide focus on comparing numbers. And what I would like you to do when you work on comparing numbers is write the numbers one on top of the other, because it's hard to compare the values of digits when they're written side by side. So here we have 1,399 and 9/100ths compared to 1,399 and 9/10ths. Students often think that this number is bigger because or greater than because it has more digits, but that's not necessarily the case. If they compare the thousands, the hundreds, the tens, and the ones, they can see they're all the same. We have 1,399 here and 1,399 here. But when they get to the tenth spot, they see a 0 and then a 9. Now, if the numbers were lined right on top of each other and they were comparing place to place, they know that 0 is less than 9, so this number is less than this number. And so encourage your student to pull out that journal, pull out that scratch paper, and to write the numbers one on top of the other so they can really compare the value of the digits. After they write the numbers in expanded form and compare and multiply by powers of 10, they're going to head into rounding. We've already talked about rounding a little, but this time we're going to round to be able to multiply and divide more easily. You automatically may see these large numbers and these large decimals and think, oh my goodness, my child doesn't know how to do that. But what we want them to do in this lesson especially is to really think about, okay, if we round and estimate, this 3 and 9/100ths is going to be a 3. Let's round to the whole number. This 304 and 87 could just be about 300. So let's make it easy. 3 times 300. Which one of these is 300 3 times? That would be 900. So we have to think about which one of these would even make sense. The other ones are way too small to have 300 3 times. So even though they can't work it out exactly, they should be able to estimate and find the answer. Here's another example. Large numbers, but when you use number sense and really think about the value, so let's think about 100 divided by 4. I always, when it's something close to 104, I always think about pennies or dollars. So if we have 100 pennies and divide it by 4, that would be 25 cents, because there's 100 pennies and 25, or 4, there's 4 quarters and $1. I know 100 pennies are $1, so 25 cents. And if I look at the other answers, I know they don't make sense. If you divide 100 into 4 pieces, it's not going to get bigger, it's going to get smaller. So A is the only one that would even make sense. Here we have think about our powers of 10. Let's divide by 10. When we divide by 10, we make this number 10 times smaller and simply move that decimal point. Next, throughout the unit, your student will be asked to multiply and divide. And divide decimals. And this is where they're going to be encouraged to possibly use the standard algorithm. And that is perfectly fine if your student understands the algorithm for multiplication. But we do not want students just to follow a procedure and just go through a list of steps but not really understand what this means. So only use the standard algorithm if this makes sense to them. When you're multiplying a decimal by a single number or a single whole number, this is pretty easy to follow, and you can teach your child to understand that if you're multiplying hundredths times something, we definitely want to keep those hundredths in the answer, or those two decimal spots, so we have a whole and then our 200ths, or two spaces after the decimal, just like our factor had right here. And again, this one has 3 spots after the decimal and is in the thousandths, so we want our answer to also represent the thousandths. So this first lesson on multiply and divide decimals doesn't have numbers that are too large, but I'm going to go back here for a second and scroll down, because I do want to show you with my document camera a way to use grid paper to show 2 times 1 2/10. So here on my grid paper, I wrote the problem, but I changed the order a little bit, because when you multiply, you can rearrange the factors and you still get the same amount. So I put, instead of 2 times 1 2/10, I put 1 2/10 2 times. So I colored in a hole and I colored in a hole. So I have 2 holes, which this represents. I have 1 2 times, and then I have 2/10, 1 2 and 1 2. Or actually, I need it this way. I have 2/10. Here's a tenth, and here's a tenth, and here's a tenth, and here's a tenth. So I have 4 tenths. 10, 20, 30, 40. So when I look at my entire diagram, I have 1 hole, 2 holes, and 4 tenths. So my answer is 2 and 4 tenths. If you worked this out with the standard algorithm, you could say I have 1 and 2 tenths multiplied by 2. 2 times 2 is 4. 1 times 2 is 2. There's 1 spot after the decimal. I'm going to put my decimal, so there's 1 number or digit after the decimal, and 2 and 4 tenths. This can be very procedural and students don't necessarily understand, but when you model it like this with grid paper, they begin to understand that I have 1 hole with 2 tenths and I have it 2 times. So I have 2 and 4 tenths. So definitely use models, because the models are something that they're likely to see on the end of the year assessment. The next lesson goes into multiplying decimals by decimals. And what I would encourage, even though we haven't fully covered fractions yet, they were exposed to fractions a little bit last year, and fractions are coming up. So using that conversation of, I have 8 tenths times 4 tenths. 8 times 4 is 32. 10 times 10 is 100. So now I have 32 hundredths. And again, I'm going to show you with some other models in just a little bit how you can work something like this out so it becomes very conceptual and not just following procedural rules. Your child is not likely to see a problem this advanced that will go through so many digits. So definitely, if you have a problem in the OLS that incorporates 3-digit by 3-digit like this, you do have the flexibility and freedom to help your child work through this. It is something that is good enrichment and prepares them for future years, but these types of problems are not something that they are going to see on the end of the year assessment. So this begins early on in the second lesson on multiply and divide decimals. The numbers continue to get a little bit larger, and so definitely talk to your teacher if you're struggling with this unit so they can make the appropriate accommodations and suggestions to you. Again, this type of problem is a lot more difficult than anything your child will see, but encouraging them to estimate and think about this and work it out with them. It never hurts to model and to talk math with your student, but we definitely don't want them to get frustrated with these lessons. Now we're moving on into some of the story problem type things after we divide. Again, division of decimals does not follow the standard algorithm, and so talk to your teacher again about whether these lessons are appropriate, because there are models to multiply or divide that are more appropriate, that are and smaller numbers. What you see in Study Island is more likely to be what your child is going to see on the end of the year assessment. Numbers like this, 1 and 8 tenths divided by 2, is very reasonable. 21 hundredths divided by 7, very reasonable, but you're not going to be asked to do it like this. In fact, let me turn on the document camera and I'll give you an example of what you should be able to do. So, if we have 21 hundredths and we divide that by 7, the first thing I'm going to do is color in 2 tens and one more, so I have 21 completely covered in. Now, what I need to do is think about if I have 7 in each group. So let me circle. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So here's a group of 7. Here's a group of 7. Then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And here's a group of 7. How many groups of 7 was I able to make? And I was able to make 3. This is what your child is likely to see on the end of the year assessment. It's not about multiplying by an algorithm, it's about modeling and breaking up 21 hundredths into groups of 7 and how many groups did you make. So when you see problems in the OLS like this and like this, pull out that grid paper and help your child work it out on the grid paper. Again, here are some other examples. We have 6 wholes and we divide by 1 whole and 2 tenths. Very doable on scratch on the grid paper. When you get to numbers like this is not something that your child will likely see on the end of the year assessment because there's not going to be 20 wholes and they're not going to be expected to model that, but you could definitely easily color that in. We do not want students to do this. This becomes too procedural and abstract, and students forget what they're even doing and what dividing a decimal even means. That comes in middle school, so it will be coming. So as your child works through these, definitely print out the decimal grid paper so that they can work these out along with you. The numbers continue to get a little bit larger, and again, we don't want this to occur, and this is not a problem that you will see. So when you get down to this multiply and divide decimals with larger numbers like this is an activity that you can skip or you can simply work through with your student. The same thing is going to occur as you go through a lot of these problems, so definitely use your judgment and this recording as a guide to what is appropriate so that you know how to help your child be successful with this unit. There will not be problems like this where you're dividing a larger number by a smaller number, so this is also something that it's great to talk about how you're going to divide this up and it's going to become a decimal, but they will not see that until middle school on the assessments. It is more of an enrichment type of a problem. We'll continue to explore this and explore some word problems. We do want students to know when they need to multiply and when they need to divide, but the larger numbers, like I said, are not something that they will see. So I would definitely use Study Island as my guide to this and talk to your teacher about whether it's appropriate for your child to skip some of the story problem lessons and instead use Triumph and Study Island as a guide. As we continue to go through, there are additional story problem activities. Some are numbers that can easily be modeled, whereas some do require procedures such as this that are not what we're looking for in our when we focus on the standards and that conceptual understanding. The next thing that you're going to encounter after story problems is the core focus lesson. And the core focus does review things that are very relevant, such as comparing numbers and rounding numbers. So the core focus lesson is a little bit more appropriate and something that you should be able to work out with your student. I'm going to head back to the OLS because when you get to the unit checkpoint, different questions will be generated throughout the checkpoint, but definitely use your judgment as you work through the problems so that you can guide your student onto what types of questions are appropriate. Since this is taking a while to download, I'm going to go ahead and open up a PowerPoint and show you some strategies on how to multiply decimals. Okay, in this example, we're going to multiply 3 and 4/10 times 2 and 2/10. So we have 3 wholes, which we represented by our whole blocks of 100, and you could do this with the grid paper, and then 4/10 to represent 3 and 4/10. So you can have your child draw those out on their paper. Then we're going to go down this way, and we are going to have that 2 times, 2 and 2/10 times. So we're going to add another block because we have 1, 2, and then 2/10. This block right here in the corner is shared. After that, we continue to draw in all the empty spaces to make a complete rectangle. And you can see that we ended up with some wholes, several tenths, and some hundredths. The reds are the wholes, the greens are the tenths, and the yellows are the hundredths. First, we need to count how many wholes we have. We have 6 wholes. Then we need to count how many tenths we have. We have 8 here, and then we keep adding on 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. I know that 10 tenths makes a whole group of 100, because if we think about our hundreds chart, 10 rows of 10 make 100. So I have 1 whole and 4/10, or 1 and 4/10. Then I need to count my hundredths, and we have 8 hundredths. So I add my 8 hundredths. So when I add my wholes, my tenths, and my hundredths together, I get 7 and 48 hundredths. So the product is of 3 and 4/10 times 2 and 2/10 is 7 and 48 hundredths. Now we could do the same thing by thinking about multiplication. I still have my same drawing as before. I have 3 times 2, and this refers back to the area model that was talked about in 3rd and 4th grade. 3 wholes times 2 wholes is 6. 3 times 2 is 6. Then we can work on this little section. We have 3 times 2/10. That would be 6/10, so I can add this section. Then I could add this section. We have 2 times 4/10, which would be 8/10. Then I could add this section, which is 4/10 times, we have 2/10 times 4/10, which would be 8 hundredths. Because we have, our decimal is 2 numbers, or 2 spaces, or there's 2 digits after the decimal. So again, we make the same type of activity. So what I encourage you to do on your own scratch paper is try to multiply 2 and 3/10 times 2 and 1/10. So draw your 2 blocks of wholes, and then your 3/10. And then remember, this block is going to be shared. And then you're going to do your 2 wholes and 1/10. Then fill in all the empty spaces and make the rectangle complete. You can shade them all in. Count how many holes you have. There are 4 holes. Then count how many tenths you have. And there are 8 tenths. And remember, we're not talking about holes anymore, so we must use that decimal. And then talk about how many hundredths you have. And there are 3 hundredths. And remember, when we talk about hundredths, we're talking about 2 spaces after the decimal. When you add them all together, you can add in your extra zeros so it's evenly, you can add up the same number of digits in each row. You have 4 and 83 hundredths. So multiplication, when you use models, isn't so bad. When you divide decimals, you can also use models. Here we're going to talk about tenths. So I have 4 holes. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm going to divide it by 4/10. So here's a group of 10. So if I divide this by 4/10, I'm going to have 1 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 groups of 4, because we want to count how many groups we created. So 4 divided by 4/10 equals 10. This is the type of problem you will see on the end of the year assessment as well as Study Island. If you have a tenth like this, but you divide it by a whole, let's see, we don't have the whole group all 10 colored. We only have 9 of the 10 colored. But let's divide that by 3. So I have 1, 2, 3 groups of 3. So 9/10 divided by 3 is 3/10 because I have 3 groups of 3/10. When you divide tenths by tenths, here we have 10, but only 8/10 are shaded, but we want to divide by 2/10. How many 2/10 can fit? Well, we have one group of 2, another group of 2/10, another group of 2/10, and another group of 2/10. We have 4 groups of 2/10. So 8/10 divided by 2/10 and independently, but you can work with them in the OLS checkpoint. There are also lots of online games that help students practice rounding, and also don't forget that the 5th grade math website has some resources, as well as this site that I'm going to include in the newsletter. And what you can do is go to the 5 NBT7 and you can read the resources here, as well as go to Assessing 5 NBT7, and there are documents that you can download that will be actual assessments that you can give your child to check their understanding on whether they truly know how to multiply and divide decimals. And you can download all of these different things to practice on your own. Of course, this is not required, it is optional, but if your child is struggling with the OLS, I would definitely pull out some of these resources and talk to your homeroom teacher about some of the things that you're going to supplement with. There are 14 lessons in this unit. The very last lesson in this unit is going to be part of the math portfolio that your teachers will push out to you. And we are going to modify this a bit probably and not use something exactly from the OLS. We're going to mix things up a little bit and use problems and maybe modify the numbers a bit so that it is more appropriate. This lesson should be skipped for everybody at this moment, so don't open it up. We'll wait till the teachers push it out to you for the math portfolio. I know that some of these lessons and some of the larger digits may get a little frustrating at times, but don't let it overwhelm your child. Just focus on modeling with grid paper and the area model, and using Study Island and some of the other resources that we have as a tool to help your child be successful. Thanks for listening.